Thank you, Chairman Hunter. Thank you, Colonel, for your testimony. I have a few questions just to get a better understanding on the removal part in particular. So once they've been convicted or have agreed to this deportation order or removal order, and DPS takes them back to the port of entry, what does DPS do if Mexico does not accept that individual?
I go back to, we can't really anticipate I can't really answer that particular question. And it would be, hopefully, it wouldn't be DPS taking them back. Certainly a magistrate can order that, but it'd probably be TDCJ would be taking them back at that point in time.
Okay, so if TDCJ, so y'all would hand them off to TDCJ to return?
Yeah, and I know we've got agreements with the government, the states of Coahuila and Nuevo Leon and Chihuahua and Tamaulipas. So that's important to have those relationships, and that doesn't happen.
And so, you're referencing the MOUs that were signed between the governor and those states, correct?
Yes.
And so on those MOUs don't specifically deal with the acceptance of migrants, correct?
That's correct, it does not.
And so there are no current agreements in place with any state, because my understanding from talking to immigration attorneys or from immigration experts is that that has to be a conversation between the federal government to federal government, not state to state, specifically for immigration type discussions.
Understood. Yes.
That's your understanding too?
Yes, much so.
Okay. And so let's say that you take them, Mexico doesn't take the individual back. Do you then charge them with this additional crime of the illegal re-entry?
I don't know that. We'd have to go back and work with the prosecutors at that point in time.
But
it may be difficult to charge somebody with something if they're not allowed to go back. I'll put it that way.
Okay, and so there's a possibility that they wouldn't be charged?
It's possible. It's up to the prosecuting attorney.
Okay, and then the statute specifically says, I guess a key element of the offense is that the person has to be an alien, as defined on page 3. And so it's your understanding that this law only applies to people that are quote unquote aliens under the statute. Is that correct?
That's correct.
So not American citizens, right?
And regardless of status, it has nothing to do with status, but the fact that they cross between the ports of entry illegally.
Right, but what do you mean it has nothing to do with status?
Because someone can be out of status here illegally and have come through Canada, number one, or they could be a student, not unlike the 19 hijackers, they're out of status here illegally, okay, but they didn't cross between a port of entry illegally.
Right, so let's
Wouldn't
say
be applied to them.
Let's say the part that they came in other than through the lawful port of entry, but specifically the alienage determination language. So how would, because it says they have to be an alien as assigned by 8 U.S.C. section 1101, as that provision existed on January 1st, 2023. And so it can only be those people, right? The aliens under this.
Yeah.
Okay.
Sounds that way.
Okay.
I'd have to look at the legislation again, but I would defer to you.
And if somebody, what does DPS do if somebody says that they have DACA, or deferred action?
Right now?
Under the statute.
Yeah, under the statute. It hadn't been implemented yet, so we'd have to come up with the protocols to how we handle it. So.
Okay, but assuming that it were implemented, signed by the governor, what do you anticipate DPS would do?
I'd have to look at the statute again to see exactly what is exempted and not, because we're not going to charge somebody. In other words, even though we're not going to charge somebody in its affirmative defense, and they can prove it in court if we know that they're here legally. They're here legally because the federal government has allowed them to be here. We're not going to proceed and let them wrestle about and figure it out in court. On the front end, if we can make a decision on the front end, we won't make the arrest.
So potentially no arrest. What if the person tells you on the front end that they are a United States citizen?
And we have no reason to believe otherwise.
So DPS
only their behavior will determine that behavior, meaning we've seen or we have reason to believe, probable cause, not just reason to believe, that they've crossed between the ports of entry illegally, not just any ports of entry, but Texas.
What if that individual said, I'm a United States citizen? Does DPS then ask for proof of citizenship? Or how does DPS determine after an individual says they're a United States citizen, whether they are or not, whether they're an alien or not, or whether they're actually a citizen?
No, we'll have to look at this particular legislation because we don't ask people whether they're a U.S. citizen or not.
And so that's my question, because this particular piece of legislation would potentially necessitate the asking of whether a person is a citizen or not, because you have to make a determination.
Understood, yeah.
So
It may. We would work with the prosecutors and determine in terms of what exactly it is that they need or don't need at that point in time. And we'll have to adjust our protocols accordingly. So this is a new ground, okay? And but like any new legislation that you provide each biennium, we look at it and figure out how to implement it.
And let me ask you this with respect to this new crime, because it's a new sweeping straight crime that impacts, and I know that we've discussed about the statewide impact and the local. There's language in here that has a person who is an alien commits an offense if the person enters or attempts to enter. Let's say that somebody is attempting to enter through the Rio Grande. How do you interpret that? Attempts to enter on the through the river?
I'm not sure, okay, because it's either you are or you aren't, okay, entered, because when you get into the U.S. soil, it could be some nuances related in terms of the border, where it's positioned at, usually at the deepest part of the river, in terms of that constitutes it. But for that matter, eventually they'd have to they'd end up on U.S. soil, simply because for us to arrest them, we're not going into Mexico to arrest anybody.
So if let's say that they put a foot on Texas soil, and DPS is seeing them.
If they've done it illegally, and we've seen it, then we'd arrest them for illegal entry, as I understand the statute right now.
So the attempting to enter is the foot on the soil?
I don't, like I said, I'd have to look at the legislation, but.
Or attempts to enter, just.
I don't know what that is, okay?
And that's what we're trying to understand as well, what that means and whether it means.
Either you entered or you haven't, but it makes sense from a conspiracy standpoint, but I can't imagine a plot where we're charging somebody, and it's easy for us because we're not making arrests in Mexico, so either they're here or not. If they came here illegally, okay, then we'll arrest them.
What if they're swimming or on a kayak on the river?
It depends on where that is. We'll determine whether it's in the U.S. or not. But on a kayak, we see that all day. They got scouts up and down the river, okay, scouting our operations every day. We don't arrest them. We have nothing to arrest them for when they're in Mexico. Okay?
But if they're now
and sometimes when they're in the U.S.,
okay.
They could be very well. What they do is employ U.S. citizens.
So if they are on a kayak on the river, scouting or not, or whatever they may be, they could be charged under this new crime depending on where they are on the river. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, if they if they entered the U.S. illegally, I'll put it that way.
Okay. Let me ask you this: if somebody is let's say they're a victim of human trafficking and they were brought through no desire of their own or intent of their own to come to the United States, but are forced to, would DPS then charge that person with this illegal entry?
Doubtful, simply because if we were able to get an outcry, first of all, that they are a victim, and unfortunately some of the victims, don't even know they're victims yet. They're being recruited along those lines. So those are some of the challenges that we'll have, and I think there's enough leeway in the legislation, as I read it this morning, that would allow us to arrest or not arrest. And that's an important concern, because there's plenty to arrest out there. There's plenty that need to be arrested under this legislation that we can focus our resources on. Those less threatening from a security standpoint, there's no need to. We're going to be filled. We're going to be full. Enough resources are going to be dedicated to this already, so we don't necessarily have to arrest everybody.
So what would DPS do with that victim of human trafficking?
Well, first of all, if it's human trafficking, we'd certainly try to identify who it is, and victim services is a part of that particular process. And this has happened before. We've actually had outcries of females that have come across that have been exploited, that have been raped, coming across along those lines, and we'll do everything we can to identify those that did it and prosecute those that do it.
Okay, thank you. And then you mentioned identification. There's a section in the bill that discusses that the arresting law enforcement agency has to collect all available identifying info, like the fingerprints, photographic information, and biometric measures. What's your interpretation of biometric measures?
Well, biometrics can be retina scan. Don't think so. DNA, it's very expensive, takes time, commits resources away from other DNA projects. So certainly facial is becoming more of a biometric. I wouldn't consider it a biometric yet, but fingerprints, in particular tint prints. And that's how we do with every arrest in Texas. And so it's consistent with every arrest in terms of biometrics in that regard. And photograph, as the legislation is written right there. And so it syncs with just like any other arrest And so we have the same process.
So any other arrest, it's normally fingerprints, photographs, all that, but this biometric,
Exactly.
so like the retina scan, the
we
DNA,
don't-
that's
yeah, we-
part of every arrest?
No, we don't
Okay.
we don't
Okay,
have to
so
do
this is
that.
going to be requiring DPS to now
No,
do-
not at all. It
No,
gives
well,
us the option, it looks like it gives the option.
No, it says like it's a shall, like that you have to.
We have to take biometrics, as I read it, but it doesn't say
Yes.
we have to take DNA. We have to take all the biometrics. It just says that I thought we shall facial and
It says
fingerprints.
collects all available. It's very broadly written where you must collect all available
Well, that's
biometrics.
not how I read it, but maybe that's how I wanted to read it, so I have to go back and read it again.
Yeah, so that might be
So,
something that we
may-
talk with the
yeah, yeah,
author
'cause
about,
that's-
especially
yeah.
if retina scans are expensive and if you're going
Yeah, we're not, yeah, there's.
88,000
There's
people.
great ways, there's great advantages of going 10 print right now. It's consistent live scan stations, they're all the sheriff's office, booking stations along those lines. Electronically, maybe hit the FBI's database immediately. It bounces it off of ICE database, the terrorism watch. So there's already things in place, the way the legislation's written, that's going to be helpful.
Right,
for us.
and I'm not talking about that part, I'm talking about these new additional things that would be required, not just of DPS, but all local law enforcement agencies.
Yeah.
They'll have to collect DNA, they'll have to, and I know that we've worked very hard with DPS, and I
Yeah.
appreciate DPS's work on DNA for the rape kit backlog, and we know that there's lots of DNA, we've been to the lab, so can you tell us how you envision mandatory collection of DNA, and then it's requiring that DPS now has to cross-reference that with all relevant local, state, federal databases, I'm assuming CODIS, all of that, this is an additional burden or requirement in the statute on DPS and local law enforcement, like you have to do this.
If we had to take the DNA, okay, from everybody that we arrest, okay, because we don't even do that right now. If we had to do it, for everyone that we arrest for illegal entry, and process it and enter it into CODIS, yes, it would take some additional resources to do.
Additional resources and time, I assume, right, for the DPS,
Yeah.
for the DNA to be tested,
Yeah,
uploaded,
exactly,
and
yeah.
extracted. And would this collection of DNA, I guess my concern is for also all of the additional, like, rape kits that still have to be tested, and DPS is working hard to get tested and has
Mm-hmm.
made tremendous progress. So now you have all this additional DNA that must be tested as well, and the implications of that. Do you know how that
We'd have to
that's a
prioritize
concern?
like anything else based on the resources we have, and obviously rape kits are at the top of and that rape hits and homicides are always at the top of the food chain in terms of, and why we've been fortunate with the resources you provided, to be able to race that backlog that's been so problematic, and it's so important, not just to collect it and keep it, but you got to get it into CODIS. So there's two parts of that, and I don't know if it envisions that. I think it says databases, but as you know well, you've been a champion that CODIS database works, so.
Thank you. Yeah, and I'd love to
there's
talk more.
No point having it if you don't put it in CODIS.
Thank you.